Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guest today is Jay Keasling, the CEO of the Joint BioEnergy Institute, JBEI. He's also a professor in the Department of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering and the Department of Bioengineering at the University of California, Berkeley. He's also a senior faculty scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and also holds other prestigious positions around the world. Keasling Laboratory develops tools for engineering metabolism inside cells and to use those tools to solve important societal problems. His work resulted in the creation of a variety of tools for regulating metabolic pathways inside cells, novel metabolic pathways to produce unnatural molecules, and robust microbial hosts for producing chemicals under a variety of industrial conditions. He has used these tools to produce the antimalarial drug artemisinin, along with a variety of commodity and specialty chemicals and biofuels. Jay is a prolific startup founder who co-founded 8 startups, 2 of which have gone public. Since the focus of this podcast is translating research in laboratories to startups, we will focus this discussion entirely on experiences and lessons learned during his startup journey. And I really hope you enjoyed this great conversation with Jay Keasling. All right, Jay, it's lovely to see you in person. And thank you for taking the time to talk about your startup career.
Happy to do it.
Jay, I was doing research on you and I listened to many of your talks where you covered extensively about your science and JBEI. And I believe that if anyone is interested in those topics, they can easily find them on the web. So I would like to jump directly into your startup journey here. What was the first foray into startups for you? What was that triggering point that led you to think about startups?
So the first startup really was amorous. And it started with this idea that we could engineer microbes to produce natural products from plants, a specific class of natural products called isoprenoids. And we had first engineered E. coli to produce a small number of these molecules, flavors and fragrances. And then a graduate student brought me a paper about artemisinin. And we looked at the molecule, the core to it. We thought, gosh, we might be able to produce something close to this. We then were able to produce the first precursor to artemisinin called morphidiene, and then later got a grant from the Gates Foundation to go on to artemisinin. And what we realized in this is that there was no company that was really able to commercialize this technology. There's Amgens and Genentechs out there, and they had fantastic technology, but they were mainly built around protein therapeutics and proteins as the final product. And here we had something that was not a protein, that in fact was the product of proteins, enzymes. And so we just didn't see companies out there that we thought could commercialize it. I had a group of graduate students and postdocs in my lab that really wanted to try to start a company. And so we thought this was the best time and best opportunity to do it. And that's what we did.
Great. Here you were, I'm assuming I know that you do a lot of basic research, and grad students happened to bring a paper to you about artemisinin, and you thought you could make that. At that point, can you walk us through the decision-making process of, I don't know if you had any experiences with startups before that, and what did you envision taking that process to the market? What did that look like in your mind? Challenges you've seen and your startup knowledge at that point?
So this was 20 years ago. I really had very little knowledge of startups. I did have some because I had some experience in a scientific collaboration with Maxigen, which was started by Pim Stemmer to take the evolution technology that he had developed and really to commercialize it, put it to use. So I had a little bit of experience, but I had never started a company, never been involved in a startup, never been involved in raising money for a company. I'd done it for my own research group. So it was a totally new experience for me. And it was also early in the biotech startup world. Sure, there were some well-established, great biotechs out there, but nothing like there is today. And there wasn't nearly the community out there that there is today. I will say that getting a grant from the Gates Foundation made the fundraising so much easier because we had this stamp on us that said,
validation, basically.
Yeah, validation that we're doing something interesting. That made it quite a bit easier to get interest from the venture capital community.
What were the conversations like at that point? Who did you talk to? The startup is new. What was that initial group of people that you were talking to? And what's the advice you got? Good and bad.
It was a really interesting conversation because we were working on an anti-malarial drug, and malaria is a disease of poor people. And it was pretty clear that we wouldn't make any money off of artemisinin. In fact, we promised the Gates Foundation we wouldn't take any money for it. And so then the question is, what do you do? Synthetic biology was very new, brand new. And it was really interesting seeing the interest from the community. And we got a set of venture capitalists who were willing to brainstorm with us. And that was really powerful because we had this idea that we could produce flavors and fragrances. There weren't other examples out there doing it using microbial cultivation. We had, of course, ethanol being produced using natural yeast, but no one had done this before. And so about that time, there was a lot of interest in renewable fuels, biofuels. And so the VCs became very interested in that. And this idea that maybe you could replace petroleum fuels with fuels made through engineered microorganisms from plant material. So that was kind of the first wave of advanced biofuels.
Interesting. This is artemisinin for the malaria disease, which was not going to make money. And you're talking to venture capitalists who are interested in biofuels. Can you fill us in like what is missing in that? So they see money. They invest only because they're going to make money. So was there a part of the research that was going to make money as opposed to the malaria drug?
In theory, the biofuels are supposed to make money. Fuel is extremely cheap, but in about 2006, 2007, the price of oil went way up over $100 a barrel, $125 a barrel. Fuels were expensive. And this was before fracking. And there was this idea that we could produce advanced biofuels, directly replace petroleum fuels, gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel with advanced biofuels, and you'd be able to make money off of it. And the margin for the oil companies is significant. It's not huge, but through volume, they can make a hell of a lot of money. And that was the idea with biofuels, is that we could make a little bit on every gallon, and that would be enough because that would grow some very large companies.
Should I call this timing was right at that point where the gas price was high? And maybe can talk a bit about biofuels and the current state of that market and the research and where is it right now in terms of economic, because you're talking about startups and business.
Shortly after that time, fracking was implemented. It became economically viable to do fracking, pumping nasty things underground to extract every last bit of oil. I don't know what the price is where that becomes economical, but it's probably $60, $70 a barrel, maybe even $50 a barrel, but that becomes economical. And the U.S. went from a net importer, importing roughly 2/3 of our oil, to a net exporter. Pretty amazing, that transformation. And of course, the price of oil plummeted, and it's never gone back up to where it was. And it's partially because of fracking. We don't put the external costs on these petroleum-based fuels. We don't calculate what that carbon in the atmosphere is going to do to the planet and how much money we're going to have to spend to repair that damage or to mitigate the challenges of climate change. So it's just very difficult, if not impossible, for biofuels to compete right now with petroleum-based fuels. Where we have a chance is with jet fuel, because we've got all these modes of electrification coming in. People are even talking about hydrogen and other modes of transportation. It's going to be very challenging to replace all of the jet planes with new ones that don't run on petroleum fuels. First, the energy density of batteries is not anywhere close to where it needs to be in order to have electric planes. They're talking about electrified planes, but these are small passenger planes, 1 or 2 passengers that can go 100 miles or so. Nothing like what's needed. There's talk of hydrogen, but even if that was practical to store hydrogen, it's going to take decades to replace all those planes.
Jay, you bring up an important problem about investors and hype, whether it is investing in renewables or electric planes. I really don't know if there is an easy solution to fight that problem of fear of missing out for those investors. But then regardless of hype, 2 things that are constant are that biology is challenging and deep tech startups are hard. I was on your webpage and saw that you have a lot of ongoing projects in your lab. I'm trying to understand how you determine which research projects have the potential for commercialization and what criteria do you use to evaluate their viability as a startup?
First, my core research has really not changed since the day I started at Berkeley 31 years ago. And that is to engineer microbes to produce chemicals, do chemistry inside microbes. And so I choose projects because either that there's going to be super interesting science in it, or that we're going to be able to use that interesting science to solve a global challenge. And so biofuels fits in both of those categories. Engineering biology to produce hydrocarbons that will function like gasoline, diesel, or jet fuel. That's interesting to think about and to do, and how you conserve as much carbon as possible, how you produce high energy molecules. That's really interesting. We've got a project now where we're trying to replace plastics with highly recyclable plastics made from biomass. It's really fascinating to think about. And the science is particularly interesting because in that case of the highly recyclable plastics, we've got to have something that behaves like the plastics we're now using. In fact, behaves even better because you want to replace it. And it's got to be inexpensive because plastic is like gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel, really cheap because it comes from petroleum. There's interesting science in there. There's also interesting applications, and how these two come together really excites me. So do I have a formula for how I choose projects? Number one, it's based on interesting science, being on the bleeding edge, if you will, and does it move the needle on the climate or on global health or on something like that? For the people who work in my lab, it has to be a bit of both because they come here to do interesting science. They want to leave with some training that they couldn't have gotten anywhere else. And they all come here because they want to move the needle on the planet as well.
Fair enough. I think we all come here to school to do science and we love it and we want to bring changes in that. And the transformation is what I'm trying to focus on after that. If you're trying to bring something to the market, there's a business aspect of it in terms of money and the timing and so on. What has been your evaluation on that front after it passes the first test?
So first of all, I'm not a business person. I wasn't formally trained in business. I don't know nearly as much as I should probably know. And if your mission, like mine, is you're working in some scientific field and you want to apply it in another field, you may not know about all the market issues. And there's so many intricacies about how the market functions and what's needed and how to commercialize something. And so then you got to bring in the business experts who really know about these things. And it takes a long time. The science often works. We can often get the science to work. We can produce some amount of product, but that's just the first step. There's so many other business considerations around that. And probably the first one is, can you excite someone enough to put money into it? And they have to see that there's a market for it, that they could potentially make money from it.
In our first conversation, I think you mentioned a few things. That's why I'm bringing up this point about techno-economics, scale, the life cycle analysis, and competitive analysis. Do you get involved in any of those aspects of it with your grad students and postdoc, or do you bring a partner to the table at that point? I'm just trying to see Consider this as a startup 101 for other faculty members if they're trying to do this. What has worked for you is what I'm trying to get at.
My PhD is in chemical engineering. And so in theory, I probably can do some very basic techno-economic analysis, but not anything really detailed. I'd love to hear about life cycle analysis too, but I know just enough to be dangerous. So I usually collaborate. In fact, on the other side of that wall is a colleague who's an expert in techno-economics and life cycle analyses. And she's phenomenal to work with. And it's just so great to get her insight into here's what your titer rates and yields have to be in order to even get close to being commercially viable, and thinking about things at whatever large scale that might be. If you're talking about biofuels, that's enormous scales. That's as big as it comes practically. If you're talking about plastics, that's just slightly smaller than that. Could be a specialized material, and that'll be even smaller. And then you're talking about then flavors and fragrances. Those are the kinds of things that you can do and create the world's supply in a very large fermentation tank. It's all relative to how much of the product is needed. Now, sometimes, and in many cases, we'll be ahead of the market. So there might not be a market for something. And so how do you create that market? And that can be super challenging because that takes a lot of money. That takes a lot of know-how that isn't science know-how.
That's so important, I think. Maybe you can give an example of working with this colleague of yours here, a specific case study, if you may call, with one of your startups, the kind of data that you got or information that you received in terms of we're going to go for the startup. And we'll go to the next case of most of the deep tech startups, they take a long time to come to the market. And how have you dealt with such cases if you've decided to pursue a startup?
The highly recyclable plastics is a great example of how we've used techno-economics and life cycle analysis to compare, say, what we could make a polyurethane replacement for using all of this technology versus what it is in the marketplace. Let's take an example here. Let's take a mattress. Most people know about mattresses. Mattresses are rarely recycled. Most people don't want to buy a used mattress. They last 10, 15 years, and then people get rid of them. And they're largely landfilled. And so it's a huge environmental problem. And Corinne's group, Corinne is the techno-economic life cycle analysis guru. Her group has analyzed how many mattresses we throw away on an annual basis. And now there are cities and states that are requiring recycling. But now imagine that you could make that mattress from a highly recyclable plastic that we could make from plant biomass. So not only would it be carbon negative, or at least carbon neutral, but you could recycle it at the end of its lifetime. Well, if you make a mattress out of this highly recyclable material, are you going to wait 10 or 15 years to get that back in order to reuse the materials that are in that mattress? How can you do that as a startup? It's just an interesting dilemma, and how you get a company started that's going to do something like that. And sometimes it's working with the incumbents, finding a company that, say, makes mattresses and would really like to have a renewable material in their mattresses. And maybe you get started supplying them with that material. But then there are also interesting dilemmas around if a company is going to use your material, they want to make sure that you're not just manufacturing it in one factory, because if something would happen in that factory and they wouldn't have the supply then they couldn't sell it to their customers that demand it. So there are all these interesting considerations that are far beyond the science. And I find that fascinating as well. And it's a huge learning experience.
Tough decisions. And that's a good example. And the other example I was looking for was where you knew that the market is not now, it's 10 years down the lane. If you have perceived a startup in that space, what was that decision like? And what was important for you in those?
There are very few companies you start up where the product is immediately needed and that there's a market for it. In some ways, artemisinin was this way. It was just the price was too high. They needed another supply. We knew that if we could make the equivalent molecule that, hey, we could get it out there. But there aren't many examples like that where the market is just ready to go. It takes some time to develop. And then if you're trying to replace something, there are all those companies that are making that thing you're trying to replace that would like you not to succeed too.
The reason I bring this up is because whether with interaction with the investors or a lot of this market analysis courses that are coming up, they want you to do the market research and see whether the market is ready for you. It's a tough one, and you can't just push it off because the market is not now. It takes a lot of time. I just want this to be embedded into anybody considering startups that it's not going to happen overnight. Even for a company like Facebook, it took about 10 years to make money.
Yeah, exactly.
And we are no different. It's harder for us.
Exactly, yes.
Good. Thank you for that. In these startups, you mentioned about grad students and postdocs. Have they been participating as founders and co-founders? What has their role been? And if any training or any characteristics of these grad students and postdocs that have been more, in your opinion, they make them better founders?
I like to involve graduate students and postdocs in founding companies because I've tested them. I've worked with them, some of them 3, some of them 5 years. And so I know them. I know what makes them tick. And so in some ways, they've been tested with me. I think having someone you know and you trust as a co-founder is really important. Also, they might have developed the technology.
Yeah.
And so they know it inside and out. They know the challenges and all the issues with the technology. In my view, they can be really great founders. These people tend to be people that like to work independently, that are really driven individuals. They have to be team players, but they also have to be leaders. And so it's a combination of qualities. And now it's to the point where I think a lot of people come to my laboratory with this idea of starting something, either their own faculty position, which is very much like a startup, or starting a company. And there are companies that have spun out of my lab, several companies where I am not a founder, I'm just an advisor. And the technology was developed in the lab, and then the graduate students and postdocs went off and founded the company. And that's also really rewarding for me too.
That is very encouraging to know. I was going to bring this up a little later, maybe now is a good point, because a lot of these postdocs that I interact with at Berkeley and other places, they want to become faculty, but then they see faculty like yourself who are doing both startups and be a professor. Is there any advice for those kinds of grad students and postdocs who are considering a faculty position, but also want to start companies? How do you balance early in their life? You're trying to struggle for tenure and other things.
I don't usually recommend starting a company while you're going for tenure. Starting a research lab, getting it up and running, finding the funding, recruiting the people, and usually there's teaching involved as well. That's several full-time jobs all wrapped up in one position. If you were to add starting a company on top of that, that's pretty challenging. Now, some people do it. It's not necessarily something I recommend. I usually recommend it for once you've gotten tenure or a little more established. But sometimes there's just something so exciting that you've got to go off and do it. I've even had former graduate students who were tenured faculty members and left that tenured position to go run their company that they had started out of their work. And that's also awesome.
I think it needs a full-time effort to run a company like that.
Well, in most institutions, you can't be the CEO of a company and be a full-time professor as well. So in my case, I've never left my day job, my faculty position, to go run one of my companies. I'm usually an advisor to those companies. And the main point is, number one, I love my job and my career and don't want to leave that. And number two, there are often people who are more qualified to be the CEO of the company and run it.
One problem that I keep getting questions about from my audience is about faculty members who want to be a co-founder, not full-time, but want a big chunk of the startup equity. I hear anywhere from 20 to 50% of the equity from the startup that they need. This, I feel, is detrimental to any startup, as that equity is the capital that startup founders use to attract talent and investors. Do you have any observations or advice for such faculty members who want to jump into startups as co-founders?
My general piece of advice, or how I look at it, is that I'd rather have a small part of a really great big company than a big part of a small company or a company that might die. Yeah. And that means incentivizing the people who are there full time. And I think everybody, when you're maybe starting your first company, thinks that you should have a big chunk of it. Over the years, I've grown to actually like to have a small part. And part of it is I have this full-time job that is all encompassing. And I really love that job. And I can't put as much time into these companies as what I'd like to and what they deserve. And so they're going to have to get people to do that. And so I can step back. I can be an advisor. I can have a tiny part of the company. And still, what really matters to me is that science that was done in my lab, things that have left the lab, become robust companies and really change people's lives for the better. And so I'm willing to sacrifice quite a bit for that, because in the end of the day, it's not the money that matters. It's actually that you've helped someone.
I'm glad it responded the way it is, because it's hard because there's that power imbalance as a grad student or a postdoc, and try to argue with the faculty about what not to do with the equity. And I hope there's lessons taught to this faculty so it makes easier, because at the end of the day, you want this technology out of your lab, benefiting a lot of people.
And I've even, in some startups where I might have started out with a certain percentage and backed off, even given some of that back. And I feel good about that, because I want the people who are in those companies to feel like what I'm getting is fair, that I'm not unfairly taking away equity that might be better in the hands of people in the company. It is challenging for all the founders, because I come into this with a lot more experience, with a name, and they come into it with a lot of effort. I can't say that I started out this way. I probably wanted more equity early on in the companies, and now I'm more of the mindset of, I help you get started. I help get this thing off the ground. That's a small amount of equity, but you're going to be here over the long term. The other thing is that you want to incentivize those people to stay in the company. And so there are things like refreshes for every round of funding. You'll build up the equity pool, and that can go to founders that stay in the company as well.
Very fair. As you mentioned, I think 20 years ago when you started Amyris, the ecosystem was not as developed. There was not as much education, and it has evolved much more. I talked to Reg Kelly and Doug Crawford, and they've been building this ecosystem up for a long time. And I think that education system needs to develop, evolve, so that there's better transitions.
The other thing I've learned is that every company is unique. There's no cookie cutter you can use that just stamp out your companies. Everyone is unique, and it's because the people are unique, and hopefully the technology is unique as well. And so it's on a case-by-case basis.
Indeed. That's a nice segue to shift the gears and talk about something more important as well in terms of partnerships. Most of these deep tech companies need partnerships to go to the market. You've given a couple of examples. What has your experience been over the past 20 or so years in building these partnerships? What worked and what didn't work? Maybe lessons in terms of things people could be careful about or avoid.
Partnerships are extremely important. You can't get a product out without some partnerships. Building a brand is incredibly expensive, and getting that product into the marketplace is incredibly expensive. And there are some well-established companies who know how to do that, but may not have the technology. The other challenge is that the startup is always afraid of the bigger company, the bigger partner that they might be trying to take them over, take them down, and they're very worried about getting too close to that partner. But if they don't get close enough, they're not going to have a good understanding of the market.
How much do they tell?
Yes,
reveal the technology?
Exactly. There are some predatory big companies, but my experience is there aren't. Not necessarily. And if you've got a really good technology, they probably can't just redo what you've done. And if you've got a few good solid patents that will protect you. And most really good companies will respect that. They also want to get real value from you, though, too. And so you've got to be able to offer them something that's of value. So I think the right partnerships can be really rich and rewarding. And it also means that the startup survives, particularly now with the challenging economics. I think it's even more important to have these partnerships. VCs are not nearly so willing to put in large sums of money on very overpriced rounds as they were, say, a couple of years ago. And having partnerships and having real products that are going to get to the marketplace in a reasonable amount of time is super important.
Do you have a good example of where you approached a partner, how that relation evolved, and how it helped see your product at the other end? With the intricacies, I'm trying to understand things to avoid and things you learned in that process.
A lot of this is on the business side. Maybe I'll help with the first partnership and getting it started and doing introductions. But usually these are negotiations that take months to work out. And usually they're done by the company management and not so much me. I will say that working out these deals, they take months to accomplish, and there's always a give and take. And then you have to be able to deliver once you've got that agreement in place. And I've also seen those agreements fall apart too. And that is not pretty and could doom a startup.
You cannot survive by yourself. There's the other side of it. So
that's right.
You have to deal very carefully. I've seen a lot of good partnerships fall apart. That's painful.
Yeah,
because nobody probably will touch you again. In some cases.
In some cases, yes.
That's great advice. And maybe we should talk about investors at this point, because you mentioned about investors and they're not putting in so much money anymore. What has your experience been in working with different kinds of investors? Maybe you should categorize into philanthropies or Gates Foundation, angels and venture capitalists. What has your experience been in with these different categories? And if any stories stand out?
Let's start with non-dilutive funding. So there's government funding. There are SBIRs, and there are other kinds of grants from the government. And these can be really great for companies, especially in tight financial times. It used to be that I would tell my companies, oh, don't bother with SBIRs. You can get money from venture capitalists. Sure, you're going to have to give away equity, but you're going to get a lot more money. And you can move much faster because you can hire a lot of people, rather than SBIRs, where maybe it's $250K the first round, and the second phase might be over $1 million. But still, it takes a lot of time to get through that process.
Almost a year.
It's a long process. Yeah. Now I've got several examples out there where SBIRs have made a big difference. And partly it's because of the very difficult funding environment. I also think that it's nice to start a company slowly and without a lot of money. There's some advantages. There's disadvantages. The disadvantage, of course, is that it takes a long time to get something developed, and somebody could clobber you if you don't have good IP. But I've also seen companies get too much money from venture capitalists, try to do too many things, and then fail. And we've got some great examples just right around here in Emeryville of where that happened, and where they didn't have to make decisions, and then everything fell apart. It's always nice to have non-dilutive funding, but in most cases, that tends to be small money if it's from the government, or rare and difficult to get if it's from philanthropies. Many philanthropies are now making investments and either getting some equity out of it or something else. There isn't a lot of free money out there. The free money might be the small money from the government. Angels, I think this has been a really important time for angel investors right now, because venture capitalists have to raise money from LPs, and that's getting pretty challenging for them to even raise their rounds. So I think right now it's pretty challenging getting money from VCs, and for good reason. We don't know where the economy is going. There's a lot of uncertainty there. But it's also a great time to be an investor if you've got money, because you can get some really great deals. And I would say it can be challenging for a lot of companies out there too, because investors are trying to keep the companies alive that they've already put money in. And so they're maybe reluctant to put money in a lot of new companies because they don't want to lose the investments that they've already made in their existing companies. But the venture capital community, if you can convince them to give you money, they're willing to take big risks. I think the Bay Area venture capital community is fantastic, and they try to emulate it all over the planet. I've seen it. Everybody wants a Silicon Valley in their country or in their state, and it's just so difficult to replicate. I know we have it great out here in the Bay Area. I pinch myself all the time that I'm here and a part of this amazing community. And it's amazing because those people are willing to take big risks. They're willing to put in significant amounts of money. And a lot of the time, they're going to lose that money.
What, 90% fail? 95%? Have you worked with any corporate venture firms?
Yes, I have.
What has that experience been like? They're hard to reach, it seems, for a lot of founders. What worked in your case?
I always like to say that it's great to have corporate investors, what we would call strategic investors, as followers, not the leaders of the round. And the reason I say that is because if you've got a venture arm of a large company that wants to work with you leading the round, then they might drive you in the direction that's going to favor their company. Now, sometimes the business side of the company is firewalled from the investment side, but it's not going to be 100% firewalled because they're still going to be making investments that hopefully will benefit the company overall someday. And so it's best not to have that strategic investor driving you in a direction that's best for them, because that may not be the direction that's overall best for your startup. And a good venture capitalist is going to help you look at the market and say, okay, overall, this big picture, the world view, this is where we think we should be going, whether it's of benefit to that strategic investor or not.
If you're a first-time founder, how do you navigate this space? We're talking about making partnerships, but then also being very careful. What kind of people do you surround yourself with to help you understand such intricacies and like making decisions? Who are your go-to people? I don't know. It's hard to be general, but I'm trying to get their backgrounds who help you make decisions.
First of all, with any given technology, you kind of have to decide where you're going to apply that technology and what the kind of market is, because that then determines what VCs you go for. Because there'll be VCs that will specialize in X, Y, and Z, and they'll know that market really well or pretty well. And they're also going to have a great network. And so they'll be able to introduce you to either companies that are also in their portfolio or large companies that they might co-invest with. I think identifying your market or what you want to go after is the most important thing. But be willing to change. A good technology, a platform technology can be applied in many different areas, but you have to pick. There aren't many investors who will necessarily want to just fund a broad platform. Now, it comes and goes. Some years, decades, they're all for platform technologies, and in other years, decades, they might shy away from those and just go for very specific technologies. But regardless, you got to have a market that you're going to go after first. But if you got a really good technology, if it looks after doing a lot of research that that isn't the right market, then you need to change. You need to change quickly. And so many VCs say they don't necessarily invest in ideas, but in people. And the reason to invest in people is that a lot of ideas that you start the company on may not be the best ideas. And you discover that in the process, and good people will be able to shift very quickly and move to an idea that might be better and save the company.
Is there an overlap in your thinking about the founders as grad students and postdocs and these VCs? Is there anything that helps you identify those characteristics? Because you won't know that you have to pivot into something else until you hit that point. How does one think about it? Or is it the education that's needed? I'm trying to decipher how they can be better prepared.
You want to be dedicated to something and work really hard. This idea that you want to fail quickly. You don't want to go on and on and on and then discover that it's a problem. You want to really hit something hard and find out as quickly as possible if it's not going to work and then move on. And so these tend to be people who are driven, who work really hard, have interesting ideas, but are willing to give up on those ideas if it doesn't look like they're going to work out.
It almost sounds antithesis to what happens in academia, where like if you start your PhD program, most people stick to that 4, 5, 6 years and then like publish and move on. Maybe it's a higher level discussion that needs to happen in academia about like moving away and this idea of pivoting and giving up and doing something better.
It's an interesting thing you bring up about PhDs, because getting a PhD is quite a bit different from starting a company. Number one, in a PhD, you're supposed to do unique work that you've done on your own, because you're not getting a group PhD, you're getting an individual is getting a PhD. And that's not how companies work. It's usually a team of people that are trying to do something. And with a PhD, you become invested in it, and often you want to see it through. And that's important too. Seeing things through is important as well. But if you're working at it on your own and you need to see it through, there's maybe going to be some reluctance to change, because if you change, then it will take an additional 3 years or whatever to come back to where you were. So I think that PhDs are really important because they give you the credibility to be flexible and to do whatever you want to do. But they're not necessarily the best training ground for startups.
Maybe we need to add on some education just to open their eyes and like do other things as well. Maybe that brings up a point about networking. I'm sure you have a big network at this point because of your successful tenure. Any recommendations for grad students and postdocs of how they could better network other than the scientific conferences? I don't trust that much networking happens there other than a poster presentation and listen to somebody. I think there needs to be a paradigm shift in better networking so you're better prepared for the world.
Agreed. And there are many mechanisms to do that networking. For instance, SynBioBeta just happened. That's a great networking thing. I don't go to it very often because, as you say, I have my own network. I would probably benefit from that, but I'm at a stage in my career where I'd rather go to a scientific meeting and see deep science. But there are so many ways to network now that just weren't available. I mean, most university campuses offer startup clubs and all kinds of ways to network. There are so many on the UC Berkeley campus. It's really fantastic. So even students who are not at places like Berkeley have the opportunity to network in ways that we didn't 3 decades ago. I agree with you 100%. You need to network. You need to try to find out what you don't know and find the people that can help you move your technology along.
Like you said, it's a game. You need to meet people outside of your skills who complement and just like be curious. I think that needs to happen. Getting out of the lab needs to happen, whether it's the evening or whenever. But we'll leave that topic over there. I want to shift gears and talk about the topic of failures. Any failures that you have seen? We'll stick to the startup world and try to learn from those lessons from there.
I'm kind of going through one right now. Demetrix is a company I started in 2017. I hired an amazing team. I had gotten the seed round. It was a significant seed round, and then recruited the team. The team and I went out and raised the A round, got into the B round, and then couldn't finish the B round because the economy turned south. And we had a huge number of people working at the company. So in September, I went over and laid 125 people off, all but 5. And then over the last few months, the last 5 left the company. We're trying to reorganize and rebuild the company. I don't know if it's going to work. It's a work in progress. It's super sad to me because the technology worked. We took the bug that initially we built in my lab, we scaled it. The company made it scale ready and worthy, got the titer rates and yields up. We scaled it to 180,000 liters, produced product, sold the product at a profit even. And yet the company still couldn't make it. It's sad, and it's been a great learning experience for me. I've learned more about the world of finance and the world of bankruptcy than I ever wanted to learn. There are many lessons in this. The leadership of the company always has to look at the market and the world view. And a really good CEO is going to see the world out there and see where they sit in the world and where the company sits. And look, I was part of the board of this company, so I've got no one to blame but myself and the other board members. I've taken a lot of that blame on myself as well. It's sunk in very deep to me. I've had many sleepless nights over the last few months. One is that I think the biggest lesson is if you see that you're not raising money, you better cut staff and you better cut them quickly. And it's a painful thing to do, but maybe you can save the company so that it can win in a later day. Bringing something back to life is really hard to do. Seeing where the markets are going, seeing what the business climate is, reacting as quickly as you can. We took a risk. We were trying to go really hard so that we could sign business deals because we thought that if we signed these deals, that the money would flow in from VCs. And I think in a different economic environment, that would have been the case. But that hit squarely in the economic downturn, and it just didn't happen. When VCs want to put money into the company, but they see you have a lot of people and they're worried about the economic environment, they're going to want you to have money for a period of time to make it through that economic downturn. And, they were looking at 2 years. If you've got 125 people on your staff, you got to have 2 years with money. That's a lot of money you got to bring in. And it just meant it wasn't going to happen. These are all risky things. Even for a company that has taken a technology, proven that it works at scale, it's still a very risky thing. And you better be prepared to lose it all. But you can also be smart about things and try to look at the economic environment. And as painful as it might be, maybe you have to make serious cuts. The alternative is that you grow more slowly. And it's a hard thing to do.
It's very hard.
Because there'll be great economic times where the money is flowing in and there's this idea that you just need to move faster because this money's coming in. Why not do as much as you can? And I think it's good to have the big picture in mind. But you also need to take risks too. It's risky for a reason because you could win big as well. And there are a few great examples of people who took big risks and won big. But there are probably a lot more examples where people took big risks and failed. And so being measured in that, I think, is extremely important. The other thing I learned is that the science and technology development is just one piece of it. As I said, the science almost always works. Not always, but a lot of the time it works. But getting it to fit with the economic climate and the market, that's a whole nother thing. And so I guess I'd say that just because the science works doesn't mean that the company is going to survive and make it. There's a lot more to it. And then I'd say I probably would have benefited a lot by having a really good psychology course or several courses. I often say that even in my job now that I wasn't trained to do the things that I do on a regular basis. I'm managing people. And in companies, it's also all about people. And everybody has, a slightly different personality, and they have things that get them excited and that drive them to be their best. You want to get the people on board who are going to match you in that way or match the company in that way. And when times get tough, you really see that, how important that is.
It is very important. I think I have a hypothesis that if I build my next company, I think I need to have 2 people on board, a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and also an economist. I think you need external eyes watching out and helping people make the right decisions early enough.
Agreed.
You mentioned that you've been sitting on the board. I'm guessing you sit on other boards as well. Are there any lessons learned from sitting on the boards for founders about the way they form a board, or just startup lessons that you've learned yourself?
First, it's important to get the right people on the board and to get some experience on the board. And usually, hopefully that's your VCs, but sometimes VCs don't have experience in your space. Sometimes they are distracted. The other thing is that the board might meet quarterly, or let's say even monthly. Let's say you really got an active board, but that's only going to be a couple of hours a month or a couple of hours a quarter. And then the rest of the time is basically the CEO and the management team of the company running the company. And really charismatic CEOs can get a board to do
Whatever they want.
anything. Yes. And so these are like constitutional monarchies in some ways. But the CEOs have an incredible amount of power, and they have an incredible amount of power over most of the time of the company. So you got to get the right CEO in place. You also have to get a board that's engaged and a board that's diverse in every way, but particularly in experience. And you have to get those board members to really engage in that period, because that's the only check you have on the CEO and the management team of the company. And you got to go inside the company, and really somebody on that board has to really be inside that company, not just the CEO, but really take a look and know the company so that you've got a second opinion on things.
That's a tough one, I think. I've heard founders come and say, and investors say, like, just stay off from management, and as long as you're being updated well. And there are cases where there's a CEO who would not be probably giving you all the information. It's a tough one, but I think if in the best interest of the company, to make use of your board is going to be super important and help you.
The other thing is, I've heard it so many times, the founders don't want to be diluted on the board. They want to have the majority votes on the board or whatever it is. My experience, it doesn't really matter, because the only votes that count are the people who have the money. You can vote as a board, but most things are done by consensus. In the end, when it gets really tough, because look, if you've got VCs there and they don't like how things are going, they're not going to put more money in the company. And so if you go in a direction that's against them and you don't have other investors waiting to step up, or maybe your funding is tranched, they won't put in the next tranche, and then you're done. So it doesn't matter what the votes are. The people who have the money are going to control things. But that's okay. That's the price we pay for wanting to start a company.
Pick the right investors and
That's
right
right.
advisors.
That's right.
I think
That's right. And it's not just about the money from the investors. It's also about their experience. I would much rather have really smart investors than investors that have a boatload of money.
Completely agree. Jay, you've been very generous with your time. Before I go to my closing questions, is there anything that you want to talk about, startups, any advice for aspiring founders?
They're super fun. They're risky. If you're going to go into the company, be prepared to work super hard as you've ever worked. Be dedicated to it. If you're going to fail quickly and move on to the next thing. And if the company does fail, this is America, and you're forgiven for that. I was speaking to some Danish investors, and they were like, one of the big differences between Europe and the US is if you fail in Europe, you kind of got a stain on you that carries for a while, and they're going to worry about investing in you again. In the US, sometimes it's even a badge of honor. And I don't know if I would go that far as to say it's a badge of honor to say that you failed, but we do have this idea that you can be forgiven and rehabilitated, and that experience in failing is going to be good. And if you've learned from it, that'll make you just all of us stronger.
Absolutely. I think, like you, I pinch myself for being in the Bay Area. I think where at least they kind of respect that you took a risk and you made that effort, and there are lessons learned in that. Maybe that's a nice segue to go into my closing questions. If there is one mistake that you would avoid as an advice to others in startup life.
I talked about this experience with Dimitrix. I blame no one more than myself on this. And maybe I took my eyes off of things too long or blinked. And it's hard because over the long run, it may take many years to get a company off the ground and for it to, eventually go public. And so it's hard not to blink. I guess if I would say one thing, and that is having too many startups in an early stage at once is really challenging because there might be 2-3 startups at an early stage
needing your attention. Fair points. And that's a good sign of leadership that you are owning up that the failure is because of me. Many people don't do that, so I appreciate that. And my last question, if there are 1 or 2 people that played a significant role in helping you lead the life of a startup founder, who would that be?
I don't know that there was any one person. I think if I had to say, it would probably be the graduate students and postdocs in my lab that I've gone out and started companies with, because they're the ones who've gone into the companies and done the hard work. And I'm in this ivory tower, tenured faculty position. They're the ones who are going into the company and taking the risk. And they've all taught me a huge amount along the way that has been super beneficial. And I don't think they even know how much they've taught me and how much they've added to my life just by me getting to live vicariously through them while they're in the company.
Great. Thank you so much, Jay, for your time. And I really hope you can breathe some life back into Dimitrix. Good luck with that. Really wish you well. And thank you for all the lessons.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.